Eleanor Whitmore threw the letter into the fire before the ink had time to dry. Her hands weren't shaking because she was cold. They were shaking because her brother had just offered her $50 to disappear, to leave Glenwood Springs, and never come back, because her presence, he wrote, was an embarrassment to the family name. She had 1 week. After that, he would have the sheriff remove her from the only home she had ever known. If you've ever been told you were too much and not enough at the very same time, stay with me, because this story is for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment and hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. And when you're done watching, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Eleanor. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Eleanor would later decide was a fitting kind of cruelty, because Tuesdays had never been kind to her. She stood in the kitchen of the house she had kept clean for 6 years. The house she had cooked in, mended and hauled firewood for, and salted meat for, through 2 brutal Colorado winters. And she read every word her brother Thomas had written in that careful, cowardly hand of his. He did not use ugly language. He was too refined for that. He simply laid out the facts as he saw them, the way a man dismisses a servant he no longer finds useful. She was a burden. She was unmarriageable. She was, in his precise and bloodless phrasing, an obstacle to the family's standing in the community. He did not once mention that she had nursed their mother through her final illness while he was in Denver spending money they didn't have. He did not mention the garden she had kept, the animals she had fed, the roof she had patched with her own hands after the hailstorm 2 springs ago. He mentioned none of it because men like Thomas Whitmore did not count the labor of women they had already decided were worthless. Eleanor set the letter on the table. She picked it back up. She walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames, and she watched it curl and blacken and disappear. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, but on the floor, because her legs had simply stopped working the way legs are supposed to, and she pressed her back against the cold stone of the hearth and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She was 28 years old. She had no money of her own. She had no living relatives who claimed her. She had no suitors, had never had suitors, because the women of Glenwood Springs had made sure from the time Eleanor was 15 years old that she understood exactly what her body meant about her worth. Too big, too soft, too much of everything the world told a woman she ought not to be. She had heard it so many times that some mornings she woke up believing it herself. But not today. Today, something different moved through Eleanor Whitmore as she sat on that cold floor. It wasn't rage exactly, though there was rage in it. It wasn't grief, though she had never felt lonelier in her life. It was something harder than both of those things. Something that had been growing quietly beneath all the years of small humiliations and sideways glances and comments dressed up as concern. She was not going to disappear for $50. She was not going to disappear at all. She got up off the floor. She washed her face at the basin. She put on her coat and her good boots, the ones she had resoled twice, because she could not afford new ones. And she walked down the main street of Glenwood Springs to the only place in town where a woman without options might still find one. The notice board outside the general store was covered in papers, most of them faded and fluttering at the corners from the October wind. Eleanor had walked past this board 100 times without stopping, because the notices were never meant for her. Land auctions, livestock sales, wanted posters, help sought for ranch workmen only. She had learned not to read them, but today she stopped. And today, tucked in the lower left corner, beneath a notice for a church social and a farmer seeking a hired hand, she found a paper that was newer than the rest. The ink was still dark. Someone had pressed it up there recently, maybe that very morning. She read it twice. Seeking a capable woman willing to serve as wife and partner for the coming winter season. Honest work. Honest living. No beauty required. Send word to our Black Ridge Elk Hollow above Marble Creek. No beauty required. Eleanor stood there on the cold street with the wind pulling at her coat, and she read those 3 words again. No beauty required. She didn't know whether to laugh or weep. She had spent her entire life being measured against a standard she could never meet, and had never asked to be measured against. And here was a man, a stranger, a mountain man whose name she did not know, who had bothered to write it down. No beauty required, just capability, just willingness, just a woman who wanted to work and was not afraid of hard living. She pulled the notice off the board before she had finished deciding. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the house that would no longer be her house in 6 days. And she wrote a reply before she could talk herself out of it. She did not write about her appearance. She did not apologize for her size or warn him in advance the way she had been trained to apologize for her own existence. She wrote about the farm she had managed alone for 2 years. She wrote about the animals she had cared for. She wrote about the 2 winters she had survived on short supplies when the roads to town were closed for weeks. She wrote the truth about herself plainly and without ornament, and she sent the letter with the afternoon post. Then she went back to the kitchen and started packing. The reply came in 4 days. It was short. Ronan Blackridge was not a man who used extra words. Come before the first snow. Bring what you need. Leave the rest. R.B. That was all. Eleanor read it 3 times, the same way she had read his notice. She looked for something hidden in it, some trick, some condition she had missed, some indication that this was the kind of offer a decent woman ought to refuse. She found nothing. There was only the instruction and the initial and the faint smell of wood smoke from whatever cabin the letter had been written in. She packed her bag that night. She did not have much. A change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a small tin of sewing needles and thread, a knife her father had given her when she was 12 and which she had carried ever since. She did not take anything that belonged to Thomas, and she left the $50 on the kitchen table with a note that said, "Only keep it. I won't be needing it." She felt better after she wrote that than she had felt in years. The morning she left the town was barely awake. A few shopkeepers were opening their shutters. Old Miles from the livery stable was sweeping his porch and gave her a long look as she passed with her bag and her coat and her boots that had been resoled twice. He didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. Eleanor Whitmore walked to the edge of Glenwood Springs and caught a ride on a supply wagon heading west toward the mountains, and the town let her go without a word of farewell, which was exactly what she had expected. She did not look back. The supply wagon took her as far as Marble Creek, which was a generous name for a settlement that amounted to a trading post, a livery barn, and 3 buildings that had seen better decades. The wagon driver, a gruff man named Coulter, who smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool, told her that nobody went above Marble Creek voluntarily this late in the season, and that whatever she was planning, she ought to reconsider. Blackridge's place is another 4 hours up the mountain, Coulter told her not unkindly. Trail ain't good after October. You sure about this, miss? I'm sure, Eleanor said. Coulter scratched the back of his neck and gave her a look that was equal parts skepticism and reluctant respect. I'll see if one of the Harmon boys can take you up. They run supplies to Blackridge twice a season. The Harmon boy. He was 19 if he was a day, loaded her bag onto a mule without comment. Though he glanced at her sideways a few times during the climb, trying and failing to work out what a woman like her was doing, heading up into the mountains alone at the edge of winter. Eleanor didn't offer an explanation. She held the mule's lead when the trail narrowed and helped the boy lift a pack that had come loose from the saddle without being asked, and after that, he seemed to decide she was competent enough to stop worrying about. The mountain changed as they climbed. Below Marble Creek, there had still been patches of autumn gold in the trees, brown grass the ordinary gray of a Colorado sky in October. But as the trail wound higher, the world grew quieter and colder and more absolute. The trees here were dark pine and aspen, the aspens already bare, their white trunks standing out against the gray-green forest like bones. The air tasted different, sharper, cleaner than anything Eleanor had ever breathed. She found unexpectedly that she loved it. She had spent her whole life being told she was too much, too large, too loud, in her plainness, too present in rooms where she was merely tolerated. But the mountain did not find her too much. The mountain was indifferent to her in a way that felt strangely like freedom. It did not look at her body and form a verdict. It simply existed, enormous and cold, and utterly unconcerned with what anyone thought of anyone. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter and kept climbing. Ronan Blackridge's cabin sat on a south-facing shelf of the mountain, sheltered on 3 sides by a dense stand of pine and open on the 4th to a long view of the valley far below. It was built from the mountain itself, heavy logs, a stone chimney, a roof that had been designed to bear the weight of serious snow. There was a lean-to stable attached at the eastern end, and from inside it came the sounds of horses and what sounded like a very opinionated goat. A woodpile beside the front wall was stacked taller than Eleanor's head, and at least 10 feet wide. Whoever this man was, he understood winter. The Harmon boy set down her bag, collected the money Ronan had apparently arranged in advance, and disappeared back down the trail, with the mule at a pace that suggested he had somewhere warmer to be. Eleanor stood alone in front of the cabin door. She straightened her coat. She picked up her bag. She knocked. The door opened. Ronan Blackridge was bigger than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had imagined him fairly large. He stood well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from genuine physical work, rather than any vanity about it. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the forearms, a face that had been weathered by years of altitude and wind into something angular and severe. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, and there was several days of beard on his jaw. He wore a flannel shirt, the color of old pine, and canvas trousers, tucked into boots that had seen as much hard use as Eleanor's own. His eyes, which were the particular gray of the winter sky she had just climbed through, moved over her once, not with the slow evaluating contempt she had endured her whole life, but with the quick practical assessment of a man determining whether a new situation was workable. He said nothing for a long moment. Eleanor met his gaze and said nothing either. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "That's right," she said. He stepped back from the door. "Come in then." The inside of the cabin was not what she had expected, though she would have had difficulty saying exactly what she had expected. It was spare, but not dirty. There was a plank table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall and was currently doing heroic work against the cold outside. A cast-iron stove. Shelves along the east wall stacked with supplies in careful order, dried beans and salt pork and flour and cornmeal, and a row of labeled tins that suggested someone had put serious thought into winter provisions. A rope-frame bed in the far corner with a heavy wool blanket folded at the foot. Hides and traps hung from the ceiling beams. On the windowsill, unexpectedly, a small tin cup holding 3 dried wildflowers. Eleanor did not comment on the flowers. "I cleared the back room for you," Ronan said, gesturing toward a door in the south wall she hadn't noticed. "It's smaller. Stays cold till the fire's been running a few hours. There's a second blanket on the shelf." "Thank you," Eleanor said. He had his back to her now, moving to the stove to check a pot that had been simmering. He moved the way big men sometimes do in their own spaces, carefully without waste, as if he had long since learned exactly where everything was and how much room he took up. "I should tell you what I need," he said without turning around. "Please," Eleanor said. She set her bag down and stood near the door, because she had learned not to make herself at home until she understood the rules. He turned then, leaning against the counter with his arms folded, and he looked at her with that same direct, uncomplicated gaze. "Winter up here lasts 5, sometimes 6 months. Snows can close the trail for weeks. I run a trapline that takes me out 3-4 days at a time. When I'm gone, the animals need tending. The fire needs to stay hot. The supplies need managing. If something breaks, it needs fixing, or at least holding together till I'm back." He paused. "I'm not looking for someone to cook for me. I can cook. I'm looking for someone capable who won't fall apart when things go hard." "Things go hard often?" Eleanor asked. "Things go hard regular," Ronan said. "This is the mountains in winter. Hard is the condition." "All right," Eleanor said. He waited as if expecting more. Excuses, maybe. Conditions. The kind of negotiating a person does when they're already planning to leave. "I read your letter," he said. You managed a farm alone 2 winters running. I did. How? It was an unexpected question. Not what did you grow, or how many acres, but how, as if the method of surviving was what interested him, not the fact of it. I made a list every September, Eleanor said. Everything that needed doing before the snow came, and everything that needed to last through till spring. I worked the list. When something went wrong, and something always went wrong, I fixed it with what I had and updated the list. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Same system I use, he said. Something shifted in the room. Then something small but real, the way a fire catches when you've finally laid the kindling right. The goat's name is Agnes, Ronan said, turning back to the stove. She's contrary, and she bites if you startle her. The horses are even-tempered. The chickens are stupid, but they lay well if the coop stays warm. Supper's in an hour. Eleanor picked up her bag. I'll put my things away then. There's a hook on the back of the door, Ronan said. That was how it started. Not with romance, not with warmth or welcome or any of the soft things Eleanor had stopped expecting from the world. It started with a hook on the back of a door and a man telling her supper was in an hour, and Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent her entire life being told she was not enough for anything, walked into that cold back room and felt for reasons she could not have fully explained that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first morning established the pattern. Eleanor was up before the light, because she had always been up before the light, and she stoked the fire and fed the chickens and watered the horses before she heard Ronan moving inside the cabin. When he came out and found the morning already half-handled, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment across the yard. You didn't have to do all that, he said. I know, Eleanor said. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, the way a man nods when he is revising his expectations, and went back inside. Agnes the goat did bite her. Twice the first week, both times because Eleanor had startled her by approaching from the wrong angle. By the second week, Eleanor had learned Agnes's angles, and the biting stopped, and Agnes began following Eleanor around the yard with an air of territorial ownership that was, Eleanor decided, probably the closest Agnes came to affection. She learned the supply system inside a day. Ronan had organized everything with a logic that was clear once she understood it, not alphabetical, not by size, but by urgency, and by how fast things depleted. The things they would need daily were closest to hand. The things they would need only in emergency were stored highest and farthest back. It was the system of a man who had thought seriously about being alone and in trouble, and it was very nearly the same system Eleanor had used on the farm, which told her something about both of them. She did not reorganize it. She learned it as it was. Ronan noticed. She could tell because he watched the shelves after she had been into them and never found anything misplaced. He said nothing about it, but the watching changed, slightly became something other than monitoring, and closer to something that did not have a name yet. The first time they worked together on something difficult, it was the third day when a section of fencing around the stable yard split in the night cold. They fixed it together in the early morning, Ronan holding the posts and Eleanor driving the nails. When his position made it awkward, neither of them speaking more than was necessary to coordinate the work. Her hands were numb by the time they finished, but the fence held. You've done fence work, Ronan said, as they walked back toward the cabin. Farm had 80 yards of it, Eleanor said. Some of it older than my father. Who taught you? Nobody. I figured it out. He looked at her sidelong. By yourself. By myself, she said. Another one of those pauses that seemed to mean something, though Eleanor had not yet developed the vocabulary for what. The town of Glenwood Springs had decided years ago that Eleanor Whitmore was the kind of woman things happened to, rather than the kind of woman who made things happen. Her size had been the deciding evidence. A big woman was ungainly. Ungainly meant slow. Slow meant incapable. Incapable meant a burden. The logic was airtight to people who needed it to be airtight, and Eleanor had lived inside it for so long that she had sometimes in her lowest moments believed it herself. But up here on this mountain with the cold, demanding competence from everything it touched, Eleanor discovered something she had never had the space to find before. She was good at this. Not passably good. Not surviving by luck good. Actually genuinely measurably good at the work of keeping a life running in conditions that did not forgive carelessness or hesitation or self-doubt. Her body, which had been the source of so much shame and so much commentary and so many looks she had learned to see coming before they arrived, was simply useful here. The cold that made smaller women shiver and huddle did not touch her the same way. The heavy work hauling wood, shifting supplies, handling the horses, did not exhaust her the way she had been told it should. She had endurance. She had patience. She had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent years being underestimated and had learned to prove the estimation wrong quietly, without drama, in the plain language of work that got done. She was not naive enough to think Ronan didn't notice. He was too observant not to notice. She had understood that about him within the first 2 days. He was a man who watched, who cataloged, who revised his assessments based on evidence rather than assumption. The town had sent him word about her. She didn't know exactly what had been said, but she could make a fair guess because the town had been saying the same things about her for years. She had seen the slight recalibration in him, small and controlled, as everything about him was as each day passed, and she continued to be not what he had been led to expect. It was almost satisfying. Would have been entirely satisfying if there weren't a part of her that was still waiting for the other shoe. Still waiting for the moment he looked at her the way everyone else always did. Eventually that slow withdrawal of regard, that careful repositioning of expectation downward. It hadn't come yet. But she was braced for it. She was always braced for it. It was on the 9th evening that Ronan said something that caught her entirely off guard. They were sitting at the table after supper. Eleanor had made a salt pork stew with dried beans and the last of the root vegetables from the cellar. And it was not the finest meal she had ever produced, but it was hot, and it was filling, and the cold outside made both of those things matter considerably, when Ronan said without looking up from his coffee cup, "The people in town, they said you'd quit in 2 weeks." Eleanor set down her fork. "Which people?" "Coulter, the woman at the post office, a few others." He turned the cup slowly between his large hands. "They said you wouldn't manage the cold. Said you weren't built for hard work." She waited. "I want you to know," Ronan said, still looking at his cup. "I don't give a damn what they said." The silence after that was very full. "Why not?" Eleanor asked, because she was not a woman who accepted things at face value, even things she wanted very badly to believe. Ronan looked up then. His gray eyes found hers across the table, and there was something in them that she was not accustomed to seeing directed at her. Not pity, not condescension, not the particular kind of careful neutrality people adopted when they were trying not to be unkind. Just plainness. Just honesty stripped of all the social performance that people in towns use to navigate each other. "Because I've watched you work for 9 days," he said, "and you're the most capable person I've had in this cabin. That's the only measure I use." Eleanor looked at her stew. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said when she was sure her voice would be even. "It's not appreciation," Ronan said. "It's just true." The snow came 4 days later. Eleanor woke to it, a change in the quality of the silence. Outside, a particular muffled stillness that she had learned on the farm meant the world had gone white overnight. She dressed quickly and went out and found the yard transformed, the woodpile wearing a thick cap of snow. The roof of the stable bowed slightly under the new weight, the whole world reduced to white and gray, and the dark line of the pine trees at the edge of the clearing. She was already shoveling the path to the stable when Ronan came out. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. "First snow," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said without stopping. He came out and picked up the second shovel from beside the door and began clearing the path from the other end, and they worked toward each other in the morning silence. And when they met in the middle, Ronan looked at her over the handles of their shovels and said with something that might on a less guarded face have been the beginning of a smile, "You knew it was coming." "Night before last," Eleanor said. "The air changed." "Most people don't notice that," he said. "I've been noticing weather my whole life," Eleanor said. When you can't afford for things to go wrong, you learn to see them coming. Ronan was quiet for a moment, leaning on his shovel. The town said a lot of things, he said finally. I should have told you sooner. I didn't listen to most of it. A man puts his name on a notice board, he gets opinions. I've learned to form my own. Eleanor looked at him. What was your opinion? That you wrote an honest letter, he said. Most people don't. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one was needed. They finished shoveling and went inside, and over breakfast Ronan told her about the trap line, where it ran, how long it took, what to watch for when the weather shifted, how to manage the animals in his absence. He told her where he kept the rifle and how it operated, which she already knew, though she let him explain it because explaining it mattered to him, and it cost her nothing to listen. He told her about the emergency supplies buried under the floor in the back room, enough to last 2 people for 3 weeks if everything else ran out. You planned for 2 people, Eleanor said. I planned for the person I was going to bring up here, Ronan said, even before you wrote. She looked at him across the table. You believed they'd come, she asked. I believed someone would, he said. People in bad situations will move when the alternative is worse. I didn't know who. I just made sure there was enough for 2. It was a practical thing the way he said it. Not romantic, not tender, just the logic of a man who prepared for what was coming and included the unknown person who might be coming with it. Eleanor thought about the $50 on Thomas's kitchen table. She thought about the notice on the board in Glenwood Springs. She thought about the letter she had written without apology and the 4-word reply that had been enough. She thought, this is what being seen plainly feels like. Not warmly, not tenderly, just plainly. Without the lens of what everyone else decided about you before you opened your mouth. She did not realize then that it was the most important thing she had felt in years. The second week, the temperature dropped hard. Ronan left for the trapline on a Monday in weather that was cold but clear, with the understanding that he would be back in 3 days unless the weather changed. He saddled 1 horse, loaded his pack, and paused at the edge of the clearing to look back at the cabin. Eleanor was standing in the yard. Agnes bites less now, he said. Agnes and I have reached an understanding, Eleanor said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. He raised one hand, not quite a wave more, an acknowledgement, and turned his horse toward the tree line and disappeared into the forest. Eleanor stood there for a moment after he was gone, listening to the sound of hooves fading into the silence of the snow-covered mountain. Then she went inside and made her list. The 3 days passed in the particular way that days pass when the work is real and constant, and there is nobody watching and no performance required. Eleanor fed the animals and checked their water twice a day, and cleared the snow that drifted against the stable door, and kept the fire burning, and managed the supplies, and mended a section of tack that had been cracking, and found and fixed a gap in the chicken coop wall that would have let the cold in and killed the hens. She slept well, which surprised her. She had expected the solitude to feel like abandonment, which was what solitude had always felt like before. But up here the solitude felt different. It felt like trust. Ronan had left the cabin to her. He had left the animals to her. He had left all of it to her without a word of doubt, as if it had not occurred to him to wonder whether she would manage. She managed. He came back on the evening of the 3rd day with 3 pelts and a skinned rabbit and a bruised hand from a fall on an icy section of trail. And he walked into a cabin that was warm and supplied and intact, and he stopped just inside the door and looked around and then looked at Eleanor, who was setting supper on the table. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Gap in the coop wall," Eleanor said. "I found it second morning, patched it with the extra timber from the woodshed." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. He sat down and ate. He said almost nothing during supper, which Eleanor had come to understand was not rudeness, but simply the way a man who spent days alone in the mountains decomposed back into company, slowly in stages like something thawing. She did not try to rush it. She drank her coffee and let the fire talk for both of them. It was only later, when she was washing the dishes, and he was checking his hand at the table, that he said, "Why did you really come up here?" Eleanor did not turn around. "I told you in my letter," she said. You told me what you could do, Ronan said. You didn't tell me why you left. She turned then, drying her hands on a cloth, and looked at him across the room. He was watching her with that direct measuring attention that she had learned did not require a shield against it. He was not trying to catch her in something. He was just asking. My brother wanted me gone, she said. The town wanted me invisible. I've spent my whole life being told I take up too much space. She kept her voice level. I figured if someone was going to tell me I take up too much space, it might as well be a mountain. Ronan was very still. Nobody told you that up here, he said. No, Eleanor said. Nobody did. He nodded, slow and deliberate the way he did everything. Good, he said, and went back to his hand. Eleanor turned back to the dishes. She was smiling just slightly in a way she didn't think he could see. She was wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. The third week brought the kind of cold that tested everything. It arrived on a Wednesday in a wind that came down off the high peaks and drove the temperature below anything Eleanor's thermometer could measure, and it stayed for 4 days. The animals needed checking every 3 hours. The water in the stable trough froze solid overnight and had to be broken twice a day. The wood burned faster than calculated, which meant adjusting the supply estimates, which meant recalibrating everything downstream. Eleanor did it without asking because Ronan was out in the first day of the cold snap checking the trapline for damage, and when he came back in the evening, face reddened and eyes narrowed. Against the wind, she handed him a revised list. He looked at it. He looked at her. You recalculated the wood supplies, he said. Temperatures running lower than the last 2 weeks, Eleanor said. We'll burn through the east stack faster than you'd planned. There's enough if we're careful, but I moved the emergency tins from the back room to the kitchen, so we're not losing heat to the cold room every time we open that door. Ronan looked at the list again. Something moved across his face that she was beginning to learn to read, the slight release of tension around his jaw, the microscopic relaxation of shoulders that were habitually set against something. You did all this today, he said. It needed doing, Eleanor said. I was going to do it when I got back. I know, Eleanor said. But you were out, and it was there, so I did it. Another of those silences that had started to feel less like gaps and more like conversations held in a language she was still learning. Eleanor, Ronan said. Yes. I'm glad you came. It was 4 words. Simple and direct and utterly without embellishment, the way everything Ronan Blackridge said was simple and direct and without embellishment, and Eleanor Whitmore felt them land somewhere in the vicinity of her chest, like an ember catching on dry wood. Not a blaze, not yet, but something real and warm and beginning. I'm glad I came too, she said. She meant it in ways she didn't yet fully understand. The cold snap broke on Saturday. The animals were fine. The supplies were calibrated. The cabin was warm. Ronan had a bruised rib from where his horse had shied on an icy stretch and knocked him against a tree, which he had not mentioned, and which Eleanor had noticed from the way he was holding himself at the table, and when she called him on it he gave her a look of such pure exasperation that she nearly laughed out loud. It's fine, he said. It's not fine, she said. Let me see. I don't need Ronan. She used his name with a particular emphasis that apparently communicated something because he stopped arguing and lifted his shirt far enough for her to examine the damage. The bruising was spectacular, deep purple and yellow, running across his left side from hip to ribs. She touched it carefully, assessing, and he was absolutely rigid under her hands, which she attributed entirely to stoicism and not to anything else. Nothing broken, she said. 2 probably cracked. You should have told me. It wasn't important, he said. It was important enough that you were favoring your left side at supper, Eleanor said. I noticed. He looked down at her. He had to look down. She was not a small woman, but he was considerably taller, and something in his expression shifted into territory she did not have a clean name for. You notice a lot, he said. When things matter to me, Eleanor said, I pay attention. She stepped back and picked up the cloth she'd been using to keep warm water on the bruise. She did not look at his face. She did not need to. But she felt the weight of his gaze on her for a long time after. And later that night, lying in her small cold room with the fire warming the walls, Eleanor Whitmore stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had told the town he needed a wife to survive winter. And she thought about what it meant that she had stopped sometime in the last 3 weeks, sometime between the fence and the snow, and the revised supply lists, and a hand touching a bruised rib. She had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had stopped waiting for him to look at her the way everyone else always did. And she did not know what to do with the fact that he never did. She did not know what to do with the way his voice sounded when he said her name, or the way the cabin felt different when he came back from the trapline, or the way her chest had done something entirely unauthorized when he said he was glad she came. She did not know what to do with any of it, but she knew one thing with a certainty she had not felt about anything in years. She was not leaving this mountain. Not for Thomas's $50. Not for the opinions of Glenwood Springs. Not for anything the world below thought about a woman like her, and what she deserved, and who she was allowed to love. The mountain had told her different. And so, in his plain and careful and completely unprecedented way, had Ronan Blackridge. The morning after Eleanor told him she paid attention to things that mattered to her, Ronan Blackridge got up an hour earlier than usual. She knew because she heard him. She had always been a light sleeper, years of living alone on a farm, where any sound in the night might mean an animal in trouble, or a fence down, or weather turning, had trained her to surface quickly from sleep, and the walls of the cabin were thick, but not silent. She heard the creak of his weight on the floor. She heard the stove door open. She heard the particular silence that followed, which was the silence of a man standing in his own kitchen at 5 in the morning, thinking about something he hadn't resolved. She lay still and waited. After a while, she heard him sit down. Then she heard the scratch of a pencil on paper. She didn't know what he was writing. She didn't ask, not that morning, not for several days. But she noticed that after that night, after the bruised rib and the hand on his side, and the words exchanged in the kitchen, that had meant more than either of them said out loud, something had shifted in the temperature of the cabin, and it was not the fire. The 4th week arrived with a brief thaw, 2 days of relative warmth that felt almost gentle after the cold snap, and Ronan used it to make a run to Marble Creek for supplies. He asked Eleanor to write down what they needed. She did in her careful, organized way, quantities and priorities and substitutions if the primary item wasn't available, and handed the list to him at the door. He looked at it for a moment. "You listed coffee twice," he said. "We're going through it faster than your original estimate," Eleanor said. "I'd rather have twice as much as run out in February." He folded the list and put it in his breast pocket. He was dressed for the ride, down heavy coat gloves, the wool scarf he wore with the ends tucked, rather than hanging, which Eleanor had privately observed was either a practical decision or a deeply ingrained personal preference, and possibly both. He picked up his saddlebag. "Anything else you want?" he said. "From town." Eleanor considered it. "Thread. Dark brown if they have it. One of your coats has a seam going on the left sleeve." He looked at her. "I was going to mend it," she said, "but I ran out of the right color." "I didn't know the coat had a bad seam," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I noticed 2 weeks ago." He stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he nodded and walked out toward the stable, and Eleanor went back to the stove. And that was the whole exchange, but it stayed with her all day in a way she couldn't entirely explain. He was gone 8 hours, which was longer than the ride to Marble Creek, and back should have taken, and Eleanor had the horses checked and a lamp in the window by the time she heard hooves in the clearing. She did not go out. She was not going to be the kind of woman who stood on the porch anxious, but she stayed near the window. Ronan came in stamping snow off his boots and set a loaded pack on the table, and from the pack he produced the coffee, doubled as requested the thread in the correct shade of dark brown. A sack of dried apples. She hadn't asked for a small paper-wrapped parcel and a newspaper from Denver that was 3 weeks old. He set the parcel on the table separate from the other things. Eleanor looked at it. "What's that?" "Open it," Ronan said. He was hanging up his coat, not looking at her. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of wool gloves, thick and well-made sized for a woman's hands. She looked at her own hands, which were rough from the work, and slightly cracked at the knuckles from the cold. "Your hands," Ronan said, still not looking at her, fussing with the buckle of the saddlebag with a level of attention that buckle did not require, "are going to crack open and bleed if you don't keep them warmer. I should have thought of it sooner." Eleanor held the gloves. She did not say anything for a long moment, and the silence was the kind of silence that requires careful handling. "Thank you," she said when she was sure her voice was going to cooperate. "Practical," Ronan said. "That's all." "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you anyway." He finally looked at her. Then one quick glance across the room, and whatever he saw in her face made him look away again almost immediately, and he picked up the supply list and began checking things off with entirely unnecessary focus. Eleanor put the gloves on. They fit. She thought about that for a long time, that he had looked at her hands, had actually noticed her hands, and thought about them, and then gone down the mountain and found gloves that were the right size. It was not a large thing. It was an entirely practical thing, as he said. And yet, nobody had thought about Eleanor Whitmore's hands in a practical way in longer than she could remember. Nobody had thought about what she needed and gone to the trouble of getting it. The farm had required her to think about what she needed, and she had done it alone, and she had been good at it, but it was not the same thing as someone else thinking about it. She was putting too much meaning into a pair of wool gloves. She knew she was. She told herself firmly that she was, and went about finishing supper, and the gloves sat on the table, and she was aware of them in the same way she was aware of his pencil scratching in the early morning as evidence of something she did not yet know the name of. It was the newspaper that caused the first real trouble between them. She read it in the evenings. There wasn't much in it. 3-week-old Denver news and market prices, and a long editorial about the railroad expansion that she found only moderately interesting, but near the back. In a column of social notices, she found something that stopped her cold. Whitmore, T.A. of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, announces the engagement of his sister, Miss Eleanor M. Whitmore, to Mr. Harold Griggs of Denver, formerly of Pennsylvania. The couple are expected to wed in the spring. Eleanor read it twice. Then she put the newspaper down on the table very carefully, the way you put down a thing you want to throw. Her brother had announced her engagement. To a man she had never met. In a Denver newspaper. Without asking her, without telling her, without any regard whatsoever for the fact that she was not in Glenwood Springs, and had not been for weeks, and had moreover left him a note on his kitchen table, making her position on his interference reasonably clear. "Something wrong," Ronan said. He was across the room, working on a section of trap chain that had been giving him trouble, and he had apparently been watching her the way he watched everything quietly from a slight angle, absorbing information, without announcing that he was doing it. Eleanor looked up. "My brother announced my engagement," she said. Ronan set down the chain. "Your engagement." "To a man named Harold Griggs, apparently from Pennsylvania." She kept her voice very level. "I have never met Harold Griggs." A long pause. "Your brother arranged a marriage without telling you," Ronan said. "Not a question." His voice had gone very quiet, the way she'd learned it went when something made him angry in a cold rather than a hot way. "He arranged an announcement," Eleanor said. "Whether there's an actual arrangement with this Griggs person, I don't know. I suspect it's his way of making my situation precarious." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "If I'm officially engaged to someone in Denver, my position here becomes complicated." Ronan stood up. He crossed the room and picked up the newspaper. He read the notice. He set it back down. All of this took about 15 seconds, and he did it with the focused economy of a man dealing with a problem he intends to solve. "You're not engaged to anyone," he said. "I'm aware of that," Eleanor said. "Does this Griggs know about this announcement?" "I have no way of knowing that." Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a tone that brooked very little discussion, "I'll write to the paper and to your brother." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "You don't need to do that." "You're living in my house," Ronan said. Under my name as far as Marble Creek and anyone who cares to look is concerned. Some man in Denver thinks he's engaged to you. That's not a situation I'm willing to leave sitting. Ronan. Eleanor. He said her name the way she'd said his the night of the bruised rib, with a weight that ended the argument before it got properly started. Let me write the letters. She looked at him for a long moment across the table, the newspaper between them like a summons from a world that had not done right by her. Fine, she said. He wrote both letters that evening at the table, while Eleanor mended his coat sleeve with the dark brown thread, and the cabin was very quiet except for the fire and the scratch of his pen. And it was a strange kind of domestic peace for two people who had been strangers 7 weeks ago. He did not show her what he wrote. She did not ask. She did ask later when he was nearly done, and she had finished the sleeve and was checking the stitching by lamplight. What exactly are you writing to my brother? Ronan looked up from the letter. I'm informing him, he said carefully, that any legal proceedings involving your name will require your direct consent, which you have not given, and that any further attempts to arrange your affairs without it will be dealt with accordingly. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. Dealt with accordingly. I worded it more politely than that, Ronan said, but that's the substance. He's going to be furious, Eleanor said. Good, said Ronan Blackridge, and sealed the envelope. Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. The letters went down with the next supply run, and November deepened around them, and the mountain settled into the rhythm of full winter. The days short and hard and bright, the nights long and dark and cold. And the two of them moving through it in a way that had stopped feeling like strangers managing, and started feeling like something with a different name. Something neither of them was in a hurry to label. The animals had taken to Eleanor in a way that Ronan found apparently noteworthy. Agnes doesn't follow me, he said one morning, watching the goat trail Eleanor across the yard with devoted persistence. Agnes follows whoever feeds her consistently at the same time every day, Eleanor said. I fed her consistently. You fed her when you remembered? Eleanor said. There's a difference. Ronan looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at Ronan with the flat, contemptuous gaze of a goat who has made her assessment and sees no reason to revise it. She bit me twice last week, Ronan said. She bites when she feels insecure, Eleanor said. She's not insecure with me. You've had her 3 weeks. I know her angles. Eleanor said simply, and went into the stable, and Agnes followed her, and Ronan watched them go with an expression that would have been difficult to read on most faces, but that Eleanor had. She turned around, might have recognized as a man confronting the fact that his goat had transferred her primary loyalty, and he was not entirely sure how he felt about it. The second major crisis came on a night in late November when Eleanor woke to a sound she could not immediately identify. It was not an animal sound. It was not the wind which she had learned in its many registers. The low moan around the chimney, the sharp hiss through the pine needles, the deep sustained roar that meant serious weather. This was something else. A crack, and then a groan, and then a rushing sound that she felt more than heard, and by the time her brain had assembled the pieces, she was already on her feet and moving. Part of the roof over the storage room had given way under the accumulated snow load. She knew it before she opened her door because the temperature inside the cabin dropped sharply as the cold outside rushed in through the breach, and she could hear the snow still settling, and she could hear Ronan already moving, which meant he was already awake, which meant the sound had been loud enough to pull him up out of sleep from the other side of the cabin. Stay back, he said when he saw her in the doorway. How bad? She said. Bad, he said. He was already moving toward the storage room with a lamp, and she could see past him that the shelving along the back wall was buried under snow and debris and a section of beam that had come down across the upper shelves. The shelves with the emergency provisions. She had moved to the kitchen, thankfully, but also the shelves with the tools and the extra lamp oil and 3 months of carefully organized supplies. I need to get on the roof, Ronan said. In this weather, the temperature outside was somewhere below 0, and the wind had picked up in the last hour. If I don't clear the remaining snow load off that section tonight, he said, the next section goes before morning, and we lose the whole east wall. Eleanor was already moving. What do you need from me? He looked at her. "I need someone on the ground watching that section of wall," he said. "And if it starts to move, you call out and get clear. I need the long-handled brush from the stable. And I need you to stay warm because I can't be worried about you on top of everything else." "I'll get the brush," Eleanor said. She was already putting on her coat. "And I'm not going inside until you're off that roof." "Eleanor, tell me what else you need," she said, "and stop wasting time." He was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Rope," he said, "from the peg by the stable door." They worked in the dark and the cold for 2 hours. Ronan went up with the brush and the rope which Eleanor anchored on the ground. Her hands in the wool gloves he had brought her from Marble Creek, feet planted wide watching the wall, the way he'd asked her to watch it. She was cold in a way that went past discomfort into something more serious, but she was also burning with the particular fire that comes from crisis and useful purpose. And she watched that wall like her life and his depended on it, because they did. He cleared the snow methodically, working from the edges in, and the wall held, and Eleanor called the small shifts she saw, and Ronan adjusted, and somewhere in the second hour, the imminent danger passed, and the remaining snow settled rather than cascaded, and Ronan came down from the roof with ice in his hair, and his hands nearly too cold to grip the rope. Eleanor caught him at the bottom of the ladder. She didn't think about it. Her hands went to his arms, steadying, and she held him for a moment, until she was sure his legs were working, and he stood there breathing hard in the cold air, with his hands clasped around her forearms and his head dropped slightly. "All right," he said after a moment. "I'm all right. I know," Eleanor said. She didn't let go right away, and he didn't step back, and for a moment they stood there in the dark and the cold, with the mountain wind around them, and the lamp casting its small circle of light. Then Eleanor said, "Get inside, I'll bank the fire," and he said, "Thank you." Not in the way you say it for a service. In the way you say it when you mean something larger than the words. Inside, they assessed the damage together. The storage room was compromised, but not destroyed. The provisions that mattered had been protected, and with the breach boarded up temporarily, they could function until morning. Gave them better light to work by. Eleanor heated water. Ronan sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug, and the color came back to his face slowly, and Eleanor sat across from him, because standing over him, while he recovered, felt like the wrong arrangement. "This happen often?" she asked. "Snow load's unpredictable," he said. "Roof was due for reinforcement. I'd been planning it for spring." "We'll do it sooner," Eleanor said. He looked up. I'm not going anywhere," Eleanor said, and her voice was perfectly level, and she looked directly at him when she said it, and Ronan Blackridge looked back at her across the table, with his ice-roughened hands, and his gray eyes, and something in his expression that had been slowly over the last 7 weeks laying down its guard. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you are." The next morning they began repairs, and it was hard work, cold and awkward and demanding, the kind of precise problem-solving that Eleanor had spent her whole life being told she wasn't capable of. She did not miss a step. She held what needed holding, and calculated what needed calculating, and handed Ronan tools in the order he needed them before he asked, and at one point, halfway through the morning, he stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. Who taught you to think like this?" She considered it. "Necessity," she said. "When there's no one else to solve the problem, you learn to solve it." He was quiet for a moment, working a nail with steady strokes. "The people in this territory," he said without looking up. "They judge a lot by what they can see." "I know," Eleanor said. "They're wrong," he said, simply, like a fact he'd established and was merely reporting. Eleanor drove a nail cleanly on the first stroke and said nothing, because the feeling in her chest was doing something that would have embarrassed her to put into words. December came. With December came the kind of cold that the mountains seemed to have been merely rehearsing for all of November, and with it came a change in the dynamic between Eleanor and Ronan that neither of them named, but both of them felt. They had grown into each other's rhythms, the way two people living in close quarters either do or don't. Either they chafe and grind and find each other's presence an irritant, or they settle into something that functions like a third thing. a combined creature that moves more easily through the world than either one alone. They had settled. She knew how he took his coffee, which was strong and without anything added, and he knew she needed 10 minutes in the morning before she was ready to talk. And she knew that when he came in from the trapline, he needed to sit down before he reported on anything. And he had learned that she did her best thinking while her hands were occupied with something else, and so he had started bringing her the small tasks. The fraying rope ends that needed splicing, the broken harness buckles that needed assessment when he wanted her opinion on something. It was a language, wordless and specific, and theirs. She caught herself thinking about it on a quiet afternoon in early December while she was splicing a rope end by the window and Ronan was outside with the horses. She caught herself thinking, I did not know it was possible to be known this way. Without explaining yourself. Without performing anything. Just seen in the ordinary moments by someone who looked long enough and carefully enough to learn what they were seeing. She put the rope down. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was falling in love with Ronan Blackridge. She had probably been falling for a while. She had been telling herself it was gratitude or respect, or the entirely understandable warmth a person feels towards someone who treats them with dignity when dignity has not been a regular experience. She had been telling herself all of those things with great conviction, and now she sat at the table with the spliced rope in her hands and the fire at her back, and she was done lying to herself, because Eleanor Whitmore had a lot of faults, but dishonesty was not among them. She was in love, which was a disaster of the first order because Ronan had brought her here for practical reasons. He had said so himself. He needed someone capable who would not fall apart when things went hard. He had been clear-eyed and direct about it from the first letter, and he had been decent and respectful and steady, and none of that was the same as love. None of that was the same as wanting her the way she had come to want him. She picked the rope back up. She was not going to say anything. She was going to continue being exactly as useful and competent and steady as she had been, and she was going to manage this new information about herself the way she managed everything, with her head down and her hands busy and her expectations firmly controlled. That plan lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, Ronan came in from the morning chores and put a folded letter on the table in front of her. Eleanor looked at it. The handwriting on the outside was her brother's. She opened it. Thomas Whitmore was not a subtle man when he was frightened, which was the only condition under which he abandoned subtlety for directness, and the letter was the most direct thing he had ever written to her. He had received Ronan's letter. He was withdrawing the notice from the Denver paper, which he claimed had been a misunderstanding, a word Eleanor read twice with profound incredulity, and he wanted her to know that her situation on the mountain was not legally or morally what a respectable woman ought to be doing, and that she should come home before she damaged herself beyond the point where he could help her. The last line read, I am still your brother. I am still prepared to help you within reason, but you must come home. Eleanor folded the letter. She set it down. It's the first time he said he's still my brother, she said. He didn't say it when he told me to leave. He didn't say it when he sent me $50 and told me to disappear. He's saying it now because Ronan scared him. Yes, Ronan said. He wants me to come home, Eleanor said. She looked up at Ronan, who was standing by the stove with his arms folded. He thinks I'm damaging myself by being here. Ronan said nothing, but something shifted very precisely in his expression. What do you want to do? He said. And this was the thing about Ronan Blackridge that had undone Eleanor from nearly the beginning. Not his strength, not his competence, not even his plain-spoken honesty, though she valued all of those things enormously. What had undone her was this. He asked what she wanted. Not what was proper, not what made sense, not what the situation required, what she wanted. I want to stay, Eleanor said. He nodded once, short and certain. Then stay, he said. That would have been enough. That should have been enough. But Eleanor was done lying to herself, and she was sitting at the table with her brother's letter in her hand, and Ronan 6 feet away with his arms folded, and she said the thing she had been not saying for weeks. I need to tell you something. Ronan looked at her. I didn't come up here just because I had nowhere to go, Eleanor said. I came because the notice said no beauty required, and it was the first time anyone had told me that what I looked like didn't determine what I was worth. She kept her voice even. She was not going to make this dramatic. She was not going to make it large and difficult and weeping. She was going to say it plainly the way he said things, because that was the only kind of truth she had ever trusted. I came here already believing I didn't deserve much. I believed I was an arrangement, something practical. And then you learned who I was. You looked at what I did and what I thought, and you treated me as if those things mattered. She stopped. Ronan hadn't moved. They do matter, he said. I know that now, Eleanor said. I'm telling you that I'm grateful, but I'm also telling you. And here she had to take a breath because it was hard. It was harder than fence mending and roof repair and 4 days of bitter cold and all the other hard things the mountain had handed her. I'm telling you that somewhere in the last 2 months, I stopped being grateful and started being something else. And I'm not going to say it if it changes things between us. I'm not asking for anything. I can't be dishonest about it. And you've never been dishonest with me, and it seems wrong to be dishonest with you. The fire was very loud in the silence. Ronan unfolded his arms. He walked from the stove to the table. He sat down in the chair across from her. Not across the table, but pulled close the way he sat when they were working something out together, close enough that she could see his face clearly in the lamplight. Eleanor, he said. I know, she said. You don't have to. You don't have Eleanor. The second time was quieter and firmer and stopped her. I brought you up here because I needed someone capable. I told you that, and it was true. What I didn't tell you. He stopped as if looking for the right words in a place they were not easy to find. Is that about 2 weeks in, I stopped thinking about what I needed and started thinking about you, about what you needed, about whether you were warm enough, and whether the work was too much, and whether you'd eaten, and whether that look on your face sometimes was tiredness, or something harder than tiredness. He looked at his hands. I wrote to the paper about your brother because I couldn't stand the thought of someone in Denver having a claim on you, he said. I bought the gloves because your hands were cracking, and I didn't know how to say I'd noticed without it coming out wrong. He looked up. I don't know how to do this. I haven't. It's been a long time since I had anything to lose. I got careful. I got very careful. And careful is easy up here, because there's nothing up here that requires you to be. He paused again, and the pause had weight, vulnerable. The words sat between them like something rare and fragile. But you came up here, he said, and you learned Agnes's angles, and you fixed my fence, and you sat with me in the cold after the roof came down, and you looked at me like I was worth looking at. And I have been trying very hard for 2 months not to say anything, because I brought you here for practical reasons, and you deserved more than that. Eleanor looked at him. I came here with nothing, she said. I know, Ronan said, and I'm not what people think of when they think of Eleanor. His voice was very quiet. I know what I think when I look at you. I don't particularly care what anyone else thinks. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said finally. And then, because they were both practical people and the fire needed banking and Agnes needed her afternoon feed. All right. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers, large and rough and warm from the stove, and he simply held it. And the cabin was warm, and the mountain was quiet outside. And Eleanor Whitmore sat in the lamplight, with her hand in Ronan Blackridge's hand, and felt for perhaps the first time in her life that she was taking up exactly the right amount of space. It was not the end of anything. It was the beginning, carefully and without haste, of something they were both going to have to learn how to hold. But they had both learned harder things. Outside, Agnes let out one long opinionated sound from the stable yard, and inside the cabin, something that might have been a laugh, quiet and startled and entirely real, moved through Ronan Blackridge for the first time in longer than he could remember, and Eleanor felt the sound of it like sunlight through a window she hadn't known was there. She held his hand. The mountain held them both, and December deepened around them, cold and enormous, and completely indifferent to the fact that 2 people inside one small cabin on its side had, without quite planning to, decided they were no longer alone. The hand-holding lasted exactly 4 days before the world reminded them both that tenderness was a luxury the mountains rationed carefully. It came in the form of two men on horseback arriving at the edge of the clearing on a Tuesday morning when Ronan was out checking the repaired section of roof, and Eleanor was inside splitting the dried apples from Marble Creek into measured portions for the week. She heard the horses before she saw them, a sound different from Ronan's horse, different in number, and in the particular cadence of animals being ridden rather than worked. And she went to the window and looked out and felt, without being able to immediately say why, that something was wrong. The men were well dressed for the mountains. That was the first thing. Not dressed for work or weather, or the kind of riding that took you up steep trails in December, but dressed the way men dress when they want to make an impression. Good coats, clean boots, hats with the brims uncreased. One was heavy-set, and somewhere past 50, with the settled, self-certain look of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in any room he entered. The other was younger, lean, with quick eyes that moved over the clearing, the way eyes move when they're taking inventory. They were not trappers. They were not neighbors. They were not anyone who belonged on this mountain. Eleanor set down the apples and picked up Ronan's rifle from the rack by the door. She did not cock it. She was not that kind of woman, not impulsive, not theatrical. But she carried it to the door and opened the door and stood in it, and she waited. Ronan came around the corner of the cabin from the roof side and stopped when he saw the men. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the men again, and his face did the thing it did when he was angry. In the cold, controlled way, it went very still. "Blackridge," the heavy-set man said. His voice was the voice of someone who had given orders for a long time and had forgotten there was any other kind of speech. "You're harder to get to than you used to be." "Garfield," Ronan said. One word flat as a stone, so he knew them. Eleanor watched Ronan's body and learned something new, the way he stood when he was calculating, which was different from the way he stood when he was simply thinking. His weight shifted slightly forward. His hands were loose at his sides. He looked relaxed, but he was not relaxed. He was the way a man is when he has decided to let a situation develop far enough to understand it before he stops it. "Come a long way in December," Ronan said. "Must be something important." The man called Garfield smiled, which did not improve his face. "Neighborly visit. Heard you had company up here. Wanted to pay our respects." His eyes moved to Eleanor with the particular kind of examination that is designed to communicate that the person being examined is not a concern. "This the wife." "This is Eleanor," Ronan said. "Not the wife." Eleanor. Her name spoken with a precision that told Garfield exactly how much access he was and was not being given. Garfield's smile didn't waver. "Pretty name. Unusual to see a woman up this high in December." He paused, letting the implication sit. "Dangerous time of year for it." "We manage," Ronan said. "I'm sure you do." Garfield reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he extended toward Ronan without dismounting. "Reason we came up, we've been working with the Territorial Land Office on a survey of the Upper Elk Hollow parcels. Turns out there's some question about your boundary lines." Ronan did not take the paper. "My boundary lines," he said, "have been registered with the Territorial Office for 11 years. Surveying tools have improved," Garfield said pleasantly. "What seemed clear 11 years ago turns out to be a little less clear now. The adjusted survey suggests your eastern boundary is about 400 yards west of where you've been treating it." The silence after that had a particular quality. Eleanor felt it in her chest, the slow recognition of what was happening. The kind of recognition that comes not from surprise, but from a pattern she had seen before in smaller forms, in a world that had always found ways to take things from people who couldn't afford lawyers. Her brother had tried to erase her with a letter and a newspaper notice. This man was trying to erase Ronan with a piece of paper and a polite smile, and the method was different, but the impulse was identical. "What you have is inconvenient to me, and I am powerful enough to call that inconvenience a legal question." "The eastern boundary," Ronan said very quietly, "includes my primary water source." "That is unfortunate," Garfield said in a tone that suggested it was not unfortunate to him at all. "What's on the other side of the adjusted line?" Ronan said. Garfield glanced at the younger man. a glance that was too quick and too controlled. "Silver," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She had not meant to say it aloud, but the logic had assembled itself in the same way the supply calculations assembled themselves automatically from available data without the need for drama, and the answer had arrived before she had decided whether to speak it. Garfield looked at her for a moment with the kind of look a man gives a thing that has surprised him by being more complicated than expected. "Ma'am," he said pleasantly, "this is a conversation between men." "It's a conversation happening on Ronan's property," Eleanor said, "which means it's a conversation I'm part of." She kept her voice entirely even. "There's been silver found in the upper Elk Hollow Range. I read it in the Denver paper 3 weeks ago. The Territorial Land Office has been doing adjusted surveys on properties that sit above the primary vein." She paused. "So the question isn't really about your boundary lines. The question is about what's under them." The younger man's eyes had gone very still. Garfield's smile had done something complicated and rearranged itself. Ronan was looking at Eleanor with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "I think," Garfield said after a moment, "that you're a very clever woman. I also think you should understand that the Territorial Office has the legal authority to conduct surveys and adjust registrations, and that what's under a man's land is a matter of public record and public interest. And what's above a man's land," Eleanor said, "is his right to refuse entry to anyone he hasn't invited, which I believe applies to surveyors as well as neighbors." Garfield looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Ronan. "Think carefully," he said, and the pleasantness had thinned down to something underneath it that was not pleasant at all about how you want to handle this. "I'll need to review the survey documentation," Ronan said. "Leave a copy with the Territorial Office in Marble Creek. I'll send for it. We'd prefer a faster resolution." "Then you'll be disappointed," Ronan said. "Good day, Garfield." The men left. They did not argue. They did not push. Men like Garfield never pushed directly. They came, they planted the seed of the problem, and they left the problem to grow in the dark. Eleanor understood this because she had watched Thomas Whitmore operate on the same principle for years. She and Ronan stood in the clearing until the sound of the horses was completely gone. Then Ronan turned to her. "Silver," he said. "It was in the paper," Eleanor said. "I didn't put it together until he started talking about the eastern boundary." Ronan was quiet for a moment, looking at the tree line where the men had disappeared. "He's not going to stop," Ronan said. "No," Eleanor said. "Men like that never stop. They adjust, and they come back." She looked at him. "How solid is your registration?" "Solid as 11 years, and a paid filing fee can make it," Ronan said. "But paper is only as solid as the person reading it." "Then we need someone reading it who isn't Garfield's man," Eleanor said. "Is there a land attorney in Marble Creek?" Ronan made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "There's a man who calls himself one." "Is he honest?" "Honest enough, not particularly sharp." "Sharp enough to copy a document and file it in 2 jurisdictions," Eleanor said. "Because if Garfield is working through the Territorial Office, you want your registration on record in Denver as well." Ronan looked at her. "You know about land filings," he said. "My father lost 40 acres to a survey adjustment when I was 12, Eleanor said. "I watched it happen. I promised myself I'd understand the process well enough that nobody could do it to me." She paused. "Or anyone I cared about." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "I'll ride to Marble Creek tomorrow." "I'll write down what you need to ask for," Eleanor said. "And Ronan, don't tell the man in Marble Creek about the silver. If he doesn't know what's at stake, he can't be bought." Ronan studied her for a long moment with those clear gray eyes. "You think like a person who's been underestimated their whole life," he said. "I have been," Eleanor said simply. "It made you dangerous," he said, and the way he said it was not an accusation. It was, she realized with a jolt that moved through her from her sternum outward, something closer to admiration. Ronan went to Marble Creek the next morning, and Eleanor stayed with the animals in the cabin in the cold, and she was not afraid exactly, but she was watchful in a way she hadn't been before. She walked the perimeter of the clearing twice during the day. She checked the eastern tree line. She thought about the younger man's eyes going still when she said the word silver, and she thought about what it meant that they had come up on a December Tuesday and not waited for spring, which was when most land disputes were litigated, because men who waited for spring were men who believed the law would work in their favor, and men who came in December were men who weren't certain of the law and were trying to make the problem go away before anyone could organize a response. The speed of it told her everything. Ronan came back in the late afternoon with the Marble Creek attorney's written assessment, which confirmed that the registration was solid. The survey adjustment was unusual, but not unprecedented, and the filing would be duplicated in Denver by the end of the week. And with a second piece of information that he put on the table between them like a card he wasn't sure he wanted to play. "Garfield owns the Marble Creek Trading Post," Ronan said. Eleanor looked up. "Since when?" she said. "Since 3 months ago," Ronan said. "Coulter sold it to him, or was encouraged to sell it, depending on who you ask." He sat down heavily. "He also has an arrangement with the family that runs the Harmon supply runs. The Harmon boys won't be bringing us supplies after Christmas." The weight of that settled over both of them. The Harmon boys were their primary link to Marble Creek. Without them getting supplies meant Ronan making the trip himself, which took him off the mountain for at minimum 2 days, which left Eleanor alone, which in serious weather was not a simple thing. It also meant that Garfield was not just working through the land office. He was cutting off their lines of connection to the world below one by one, with the patient and methodical approach of a man who understood that isolation was as effective as confrontation and considerably less visible. "He's trying to starve us out," Eleanor said. "Or freeze us out," Ronan said. "Same result." "What's his timeline?" Ronan looked at her. "He filed for an emergency survey review. Territorial office can act on it within 60 days. 60 days, Eleanor repeated. "That's February. Middle of the worst of winter," Ronan said. "When travel is hardest, and a man up here has least ability to fight illegal action in person." Eleanor sat back. She looked at the ceiling. She thought. She let the problem assemble itself the way she let everything assemble itself, without rushing it, without panic turning it over and examining its angles, the way she had learned Agnes's angles, looking for the place where the thing could be approached without getting bitten. "He needs Ronan off this land before the survey decision comes down," she said half to herself. "If Ronan's here and filing counterclaims, the Denver office will have to adjudicate. That takes months. Months Garfield doesn't have, because whoever gets to the silver first has the prior claim." She looked at Ronan. "He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make it impossible for you to stay long enough for the court to matter." "That's about the size of it," Ronan said. "Then we don't leave," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, we don't leave," she said again, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there in September. Something that the mountain had built in her over the months of cold and hard work, and the discovery that she was more than what people had told her she was. "We file the counterclaim. We document everything. We outlast him. He's betting that you'll give up or be forced out before the review. We bet that you won't." Ronan looked at her for a long time. "It's going to get harder," he said, "before it gets better." "I know," Eleanor said. "I didn't come up here because I thought things would be easy." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same way he had in December, after she told him the truth, and he said quietly, "I know you didn't." The next 3 weeks were the hardest Eleanor had experienced on the mountain, and the mountain had already set a considerable bar. Garfield's men came twice more. Always the younger one, the lean one with the quick inventory. Eyes always alone, always with a document, or a question, or a piece of information that was designed to seem helpful, while actually being a pressure point. The second visit, he brought paperwork from the territorial office that looked official enough that Eleanor sat with it for an hour before she found the detail that wasn't right. The filing date was wrong by 11 days, which moved it outside the window for the type of claim being made. She wrote it down. She showed it to Ronan. He copied it and sent it to Denver by the next available rider. The third visit, the man, his name was Aldred, she'd learned. Garfield's nephew, which explained the quick inventory eyes and the way he watched everything like he was being tested, came while Ronan was on the trap line. He knew Ronan was on the trap line. Eleanor was certain of it. He stood in the yard and smiled in the same way Garfield smiled, only younger and less polished. And he said, "Ma'am, Ronan around." "He'll be back this evening," Eleanor said. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and her face arranged in its most neutral expression, which was a face she had considerable practice making. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Just wanted to make sure you folks were managing all right," Aldred said. "Winter's been hard this year. Shame the Harmon boys couldn't keep up the supply runs." He paused, letting the shame sit. Mr. Garfield mentioned he'd be willing to arrange alternative supply arrangements. Reasonable rates, in exchange for a conversation about the boundary question. Eleanor looked at him. "Tell Mr. Garfield," she said, "that our supply situation is managed and that we have no interest in conversations arranged as exchanges." Aldred tilted his head. "That's a hard position, ma'am, for a woman alone on a mountain in January." "I'm not alone," Eleanor said, and the steadiness in her voice was real and complete. "And my position is what it is. Good day." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a full minute, breathing slowly, feeling her heart working harder than she wanted it to work. Not from fear. From the effort of holding a line when every instinct trained into her by a lifetime of being underestimated was whispering that she was too small for this, too little, too ordinary, to hold anything against men with money and connections and the territorial land office in their pocket. She pushed that voice down. She was Eleanor Whitmore. She had fixed 80 yards of fence alone. She had kept a farm through 2 winters without help. She had climbed a mountain that the whole town of Glenwood Springs told her would break her, and she had not broken. She was not going to be unseated by a man with a lawyer and a polished smile. When Ronan came back that evening, she told him everything Aldred had said, word for word, including the exact phrasing about a woman alone on a mountain. She watched Ronan's jaw tighten. When she got to that part, a small, precise movement that she had come to understand as the external indicator of an internal temperature rising. "He said that," Ronan said. "He did," Eleanor said. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "He won't say it again," he said. "Ronan, not a threat," he said. "Just a fact. Next time they come, I'll be here." He looked at her. "You handled it right. You told me exactly what I needed to know in the right order without leaving anything out." "I know how to report a situation," Eleanor said. "I know you do," Ronan said. And then, because they were both tired, and the situation was difficult, and some things did not need ornamentation. "I'm proud of you." It landed somewhere in Eleanor's chest, like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples moving outward through everything warm and real, and slightly dangerous in what they implied about how much his opinion had come to matter. She ate her supper, and did not say much, and afterward by the fire, Ronan spread out the territorial maps he had managed to obtain from the Marble Creek attorney. And they went over the boundary lines together, Eleanor marking the coordinates she had memorized from the documentation, Ronan confirming the physical landmarks he knew from 11 years of walking the land. Their heads were close together over the map. His shoulder was warm against hers. The fire was loud. Outside, the mountain was doing what it did in January, being enormous and cold and indifferent to the small human drama unfolding on its side. And inside, 2 people who had arrived at each other by accident were trying to protect what they had built with the only tools available to them: honesty, intelligence, and the particular stubbornness of people who had been underestimated for long enough to know how dangerous that made them. "Here," Eleanor said, putting her finger on the map. "This is where the water source actually sits relative to the adjusted line they're claiming. And here's where the silver vein would run," Ronan said, tracing a line with his own finger that ended just inside the adjusted boundary. They both looked at the map. "He needs about 300 yards, Eleanor said. "That's all. If the boundary shifts 300 yards west, the vein is on his side." 300 yards, Ronan said. 11 years I've been working that land, and it's 300 yards between what I have and what someone decides they want. He sounded tired in a way that went deeper than the body. Eleanor looked at him. "We're not going to let him have it," she said. Ronan looked at her. His gray eyes in the firelight were something she had learned to read over months of watching what was hard in them, and what was soft, and where the line between the two ran. Right now, they were both. "I haven't fought for anything in a long time," he said. "After my wife died, I stopped." He paused. "I stopped seeing the point, of accumulating, of protecting. It was just me and the mountain, and that was enough." Eleanor held very still. He had never spoken about his wife before. She had known there was a wife. The history of it lived in the cabin in small ways. A cup on the shelf that he never used but never removed a quilt on the back room bed that was different from the others. But she had not asked because she was not a woman who pulled at threads that were being held carefully. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked very quietly. "May," Ronan said. "How long ago?" 5 years. He was looking at the fire now, not at the map. "Fever. January like this. I couldn't get a doctor up in time." He was quiet for a moment. "After that, I figured I'd just manage. Keep things running. Not let anything matter too much." Eleanor understood this. She understood it in the specific way you understand something that lives in the same room as your own history. "And then you put a notice on a board," she said. He looked at her. "And then I put a notice on a board," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not quite humor, not quite grief, but something that occupied the space between them and understood both. "Because one more winter alone felt like more than I could manage." "And now," Eleanor said. He reached out and turned the lamp wick up slightly the way he did when he wanted more light on something he was examining closely. "Now," he said, "I have something worth fighting for again." He looked at her directly. "That's your doing." Eleanor sat with that. Outside, the wind shifted, and both of them felt it, the change in pressure, the particular drop in sound that meant the mountain was preparing something serious. And they looked at each other with the synchronized attention of two people who had spent months learning to read the same signals, and Ronan said, "Storm," and Eleanor was already getting up. They spent the next hour securing everything that needed securing the animals. The wood supply, the areas of the roof still vulnerable from the November repair, the storage room door that could catch wind and tear if it wasn't properly latched. They worked in the dark and the rising wind without speaking much, because they had learned each other's rhythms well enough that much of the work didn't require speech, and when they came back inside, they were both cold to the bone, but everything was as solid as they could make it. Then Eleanor noticed the light. Not lightning wrong color, wrong quality, too steady. A lamp moving through the trees at the eastern edge of the clearing. More than one lamp, moving toward the cabin with the kind of deliberate steadiness that was not lost travelers and was not Marble Creek suppliers and was not anything innocent. "Ronan," she said. He was already at the window. The lamp stopped at the edge of the clearing. 3 of them. And in the light they threw, Eleanor could make out the shapes of men, and behind the men, the angular shape of something she needed a moment to identify. Survey equipment. They had come in the night, in the beginning of a storm with survey equipment. "They're going to stake the new boundary tonight," Eleanor said very quietly. "If the stakes are in the ground, it changes the legal standing of the existing documentation." Ronan was already moving toward his coat. "I know," he said. "You can't go out there alone," Eleanor said. "I know that too," he said. He turned around. His face was completely calm, in the way it was always completely calm when he had made a decision and was implementing it. "I'm not going out there alone." She was already pulling on her coat. "The documentation," she said. "The copies we made. They're in the tin in the kitchen. If anything happens—" "Nothing is going to happen," Ronan said. He was loading the rifle with the steady, practiced motion of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "But yes, the tin stays here." They looked at each other across the kitchen. Outside, the wind was beginning to build into something serious. The lamps at the edge of the clearing had started to move again, coming closer now, no longer hesitating. "Together," Eleanor said. Ronan picked up the rifle. Together, he said. And they went out into the storm. The wind hit them the moment they stepped outside, and it was serious wind, the kind that comes off the high peaks in January, with intention carrying ice in it, pushing against a person with the flat, impersonal force of something that has no opinion about whether you survive it or not. There were 4 men at the edge of the clearing. Eleanor had counted 3 lamps from the window, but there were 4 men. Aldred was one of them. She recognized his lean shape, even in the dark, and beside him was a man she didn't know, carrying survey equipment, and behind them were 2 larger men who were not carrying anything except their own considerable weight, which told her clearly what their function was. Garfield had not come himself. Of course he hadn't. Men like Garfield sent the problem ahead and arrived only for the resolution. Ronan walked out ahead of Eleanor, which she allowed because it made tactical sense. He was bigger, he was known to these men, and the rifle in his hands was visible in the lamplight. She came out 2 steps behind, and to his left, which put her in a position to watch the men on the edges, while Ronan dealt with the center. "Aldred," Ronan said. His voice carried easily over the wind. Aldred stopped walking. His eyes moved from Ronan to Eleanor and back. "Mr. Blackridge," he said. "Sorry for the hour. Survey work doesn't wait on weather." "Survey work on my land does," Ronan said. "That's the question, isn't it?" Aldred said pleasantly. "Whose land? We have documentation." "I've seen your documentation," Ronan said. "The filing date is wrong by 11 days, which puts it outside the review window for the type of claim you're making. I sent a copy of that discrepancy to Denver 4 days ago." A pause. The 2 large men shifted. Aldred's pleasant expression did some adjusting. "That's a matter for the territorial office to determine." "It is," Ronan said, "which is why there will be no survey staking on this property tonight or any night until the territorial office makes that determination. You're welcome to wait." "We're not leaving," Aldred said, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now. "Yes," Ronan said very quietly. "You are." One of the large men took a step forward. Eleanor said clearly, and without raising her voice, "I have the dates, the filing reference numbers, and the surveyor's license number for the man standing to your left, written in a document that went to the Denver Land Office by Ryder 3 days ago. If that equipment touches this ground tonight, it becomes evidence of illegal survey activity following a documented filing irregularity. That's not a territorial dispute anymore. That's a criminal matter." Everyone looked at her. The surveyor looked at his equipment. Then he looked at Aldred. Then he looked at the equipment again with the expression of a man reconsidering his professional choices. "She's bluffing," Aldred said. "The rider's name was Cass Emberley," Eleanor said. "He left Marble Creek on Thursday. You can verify it with the livery. He charges 3 cents a mile, and he always asks for payment in advance, which Ronan gave him before I finished writing the document." The wind pushed hard between them all. The surveyor took a step back from his equipment. "Aldred," one of the large men said low. Aldred looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not pleasant, or young, or confident. It was the expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting it to be empty and found it occupied. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Ronan said. "It isn't, but tonight it is. Get off my land." They went. Not quickly, not with any grace, but they went. The surveyor first, then the 2 large men, then Aldred last, and Eleanor watched each of them disappear into the tree line with the patient attention of someone making sure the door was actually closing before she relaxed. When the last lamp had been swallowed by the dark, she let herself breathe. Ronan turned around. He looked at her for a long moment in the wind and the dark with his rifle in his hands and ice collecting in his hair, and he said, "The rider's name, Cass Emberley." "Real person," Eleanor said. "Works out of Marble Creek. Ronan did actually send documents to Denver. I added the detail because Aldred needed to believe that someone specific and verifiable had made the trip." "You were ready for that," Ronan said. "You had that ready." "I had several versions of it ready," Eleanor said, "depending on which approach they took." He stared at her. Several versions, he said. The surveyor was the key, Eleanor said. A man with a license has more to lose than hired muscle. If he walked away from the equipment, the others had nothing to anchor to. She paused. I thought about it while you were on the trap line last week. Ronan was still looking at her with that expression she had no clean name for, except that it moved through her every time she saw it. Come inside, he said. You're going to freeze. You're going to freeze, Eleanor said. Eleanor. Ronan. Inside, he said. And the tone was the tone that ended discussions. And Eleanor went inside, and the storm wrapped itself around the cabin, and the world narrowed down to the firelight, and the two of them, and it was somehow in the middle of everything that was happening, almost peaceful. The storm ran for 2 days. During those 2 days, the cabin was the whole world, just the two of them, and the animals, and the fire, and the wind against the walls, and Eleanor found herself thinking in the strange compressed way that storms force thinking that she would remember these 2 days for the rest of her life. Not because of what was said, though some of what was said mattered enormously, but because of the texture of it. Ronan at the table with his maps and his careful thinking, Eleanor at the stove or the window or across the table from him, both of them working the problem together in a way that felt as natural as breathing, as if they had been doing exactly this for years. He told her more about May, not a lot. Ronan was not a man who told a lot about anything. But in the second evening of the storm, with the wind screaming outside and the fire burning high, he talked about her in the way people talk about the dead. When they have finally made a small peace, with the loss, not without grief, but with the grief settled rather than raw, lying still, rather than moving. May had been from Pennsylvania, which was perhaps why the name Harold Griggs of Pennsylvania had landed wrong with Eleanor from the moment she read it in the newspaper. She had been a school teacher. She had laughed at things that Ronan said that he hadn't known were funny until she laughed at them. She had died at 31, which was young, which was the kind of young that left a mark on a person that didn't heal so much as scar over. She would have liked you, Ronan said. He was looking at the fire. She had no patience for people who accepted the room's assessment of them. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, holding her coffee cup. What was the room's assessment of her? She asked. School teacher from Pennsylvania living alone in Colorado, Ronan said. They had opinions. A pause. She didn't care. She cared about the work. She cared about the students. She cared about whether the things she spent her time on were worth spending time on. He turned the cup slowly. She would have said you were worth spending time on. Eleanor felt something move through her that had no simple name. I'm sorry you lost her, she said. I'm sorry too, Ronan said, simply and completely the way he always said things. For a long time, losing her made everything else feel beside the point. He paused. It took someone knocking on that door who wasn't willing to be beside the point. Eleanor looked at him. I knocked fairly quietly, she said. You knocked, Ronan said, exactly loud enough. The storm broke on the third morning, and with it came a clarity of cold and light that the mountains produced after serious weather, everything sharp-edged and bright and cleaned of ambiguity. And into that clarity, riding hard up the trail from Marble Creek, came a man Eleanor had never seen before. He was on a good horse. He was dressed like someone who spent time between cities and didn't belong entirely to either. He had a saddlebag full of papers and the look of a man who had been riding for several hours and was not pleased about it. Ronan opened the door before the man reached the porch. Blackridge, the man said, breathing hard. Name's Forsyth, land attorney out of Denver. Your filing arrived on Tuesday. I rode up yesterday and got caught in the storm at Marble Creek. Ronan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor had not sent for a Denver attorney. I didn't, she started. Someone did, Forsyth said. He reached into his saddlebag and produced an envelope which he handed to Ronan. That letter came with the filing. Asked specifically for a Denver attorney to review the case in person. Ronan opened the envelope. Eleanor watched his face as he read it. Something changed in it, not dramatically. Not in the theatrical way of a man receiving a surprise, but in the small, precise way of a man revising a belief he had held for a long time. He handed Eleanor the letter. The handwriting was Thomas Whitmore's. Eleanor read it once. Then again, Thomas had written to the Denver land office 3 weeks ago, before the storm, before Aldred's night visit, before any of it, and had explained that his sister was residing on land being threatened by a fraudulent survey claim, and that given the involvement of a territorial land office employee named Garfield with a documented financial interest in the silver claims adjacent, he was requesting that an independent attorney review the matter. He had apparently included a not inconsiderable sum of money to fund that review. At the bottom, in his careful, cowardly handwriting that she had hated since childhood, "I am still your brother. I should have been better at it. This is what I can do now." Eleanor set the letter down on the table. She pressed both hands flat on either side of it and looked at it for a long moment. "Your brother," Ronan said quietly. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He's been working on this for 3 weeks. Apparently. Without telling you. That is his style," Eleanor said. Her voice was not what she wanted it to be. It was thicker than she intended, carrying more than she wanted to carry in front of a stranger. She picked up the letter and folded it precisely and set it in the tin with the other documents, and then she looked at Forsyth, who had the good grace to be examining the ceiling. "What do you need from us?" she said. Forsyth turned out to be thorough, which was worth considerably more than sharp in Eleanor's assessment of attorneys. He spent 2 days at the cabin going through every document, every filing, every letter, cross-referencing the survey claim dates against the territorial office calendar, with the meticulous attention of a man who had caught people doing exactly this kind of thing before and enjoyed finding the exact moment where the deception had been constructed. He found 3 of them. Not just the filing date. Eleanor had caught 2 others, smaller and more carefully hidden, that together created a pattern that was not a clerical error and was not a surveying discrepancy, but was, as Forsyth put it, with the restrained satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict, he was confident in deliberate fraud. "Garfield," he said on the second evening, "has been working this territory for 2 years. You're not the first boundary adjustment he's filed. You're the first one where someone actually looked at the dates." Eleanor and Ronan both looked at Eleanor. Forsyth noticed. "The woman who looked at the dates," he amended with something in his voice that was not quite embarrassment, but was in the neighborhood. "What happens now?" Ronan said. "I file an injunctions in Denver that stops any survey activity on this property pending a full fraud investigation," Forsyth said. "That takes about 2 weeks to process. In the meantime, Garfield can't legally touch your boundary lines, and if he tries, he's in contempt." He closed his satchel. "The investigation itself will take longer. Could be months. But the injunction is what matters now. It stops the clock." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "My eastern water source," he said. "Protected under the injunction," Forsyth said, "as is the existing registered boundary." Ronan looked at the fire. Eleanor watched him absorb it, the relief which was real, and underneath the relief, something else, the particular feeling of a man who has been fighting something hard for long enough that the end of the fighting takes a moment to become real. She knew that feeling. She had felt it when she walked out of Glenwood Springs with her bag and her coat and the 2-cent note to Thomas. The moment when the thing you've been bracing against lets go. "What do we owe you?" Ronan said to Forsyth. "Your brother-in-law covered the initial retainer," Forsyth said carefully. "He's not," Eleanor started. "He signed the letter that way," Forsyth said, and looked at Eleanor with a directness that suggested he was choosing his words with some purpose. "He signed it Thomas Whitmore, brother-in-law to Eleanor Blackridge. I assumed that was the current arrangement." The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Eleanor with an expression she had no difficulty reading at all, because she had learned his face over months of paying close attention to things that mattered to her. And what was on his face right now was not surprise and was not confusion. What was on his face was a question, and underneath the question was a certainty that had been building since September and had become somewhere in the storms and the documents and the nights by the fire as solid as the mountain under them. Forsyth stood up. "I'll just see to my horse," he said, and left with the tactful speed of a man who understood when a room needed to be emptied. The door closed. Eleanor turned her coffee cup. "Thomas signed the letter that way," she said. I know, Ronan said. He assumed. He did. She looked at him directly. Did he assume wrong? Ronan got up from his chair. He crossed to where she was sitting, and he stood in front of her. She had to tilt her head back to look at him from the chair, which put her at the kind of disadvantage that should have made her feel small, and which somehow did not. And he said, I put a notice on a board that said, "No beauty required," because I didn't know how else to say that I needed someone real. I needed someone who would work alongside me, and not quit, and tell me the truth, and let me tell the truth back. He stopped. I didn't know I was asking for you specifically. I didn't know you existed, but I was asking for you. Eleanor looked at him. You're not asking in the conventional way, she said. No, he said. Most men get down on one knee. I reckon most men haven't spent 4 months watching the woman they want to ask, save their land, manage their livestock, outthink a corrupt territorial agent, and talk sense into his goat, Ronan said. And there it was, the thing she had heard only a few times before. The quiet, startled humor underneath the severity, the thing that May had apparently known how to bring out of him. I figured you'd find the conventional approach insufficient. Eleanor stood up. She was not a small woman, and when she stood, she was close to him, and she looked at him without flinching or diminishing or doing any of the things she had spent 28 years doing when the world looked back at her. Ask me properly, she said. He took her hands in his. Eleanor Whitmore, he said, will you marry me? It was not quite a question. It was too certain to be a question. But it had the shape of one, and she honored the shape. Yes, she said. I will. He held her hands for a moment, large and rough and warm. The hands she had thought about since the gloves from Marble Creek, the hands that had braced on the roof in December, and hauled supplies and touched her carefully when she was uncertain and held the rifle steady in the January dark. And then he did something she had not expected. He pulled her in, not tentatively, not carefully. With the directness of a man who had been careful for long enough and had decided this particular moment did not require it. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent her entire life apologizing for taking up space, let herself be held by him in the firelight of the cabin they had kept alive together. And she did not make herself smaller, and she did not apologize. And she felt the solid truth of it, that she was exactly the right size for this. Exactly the right size for all of it. And had been from the beginning. Forsyth came back in from the horse with snow on his boots and excellent professional timing, and he sat down at the table and began preparing his documents with complete and admirably performed absorption. And Eleanor made coffee, and Ronan laid more wood on the fire, and the mountain outside was cold and enormous and entirely indifferent. And inside the cabin, something had been decided that no land office, and no fraudulent survey, and no man with a polished smile and an inventory gaze would ever be able to touch. The news moved down the mountain in the way news always moves in mountain country, slowly, then all at once and with embellishments. By the time it reached Glenwood Springs, the story had taken on the particular texture of legend that small communities apply to events that confirm what they want to believe about the world. There were versions of it where Ronan had driven Garfield's men off the mountain single-handed. There were versions where Eleanor had produced legal documents from nowhere and rendered the surveyors legally paralyzed on the spot. There were versions that were closer to the truth, and versions that were almost unrecognizable, and versions somewhere in between. What all the versions agreed on, the woman they had sent up the mountain to disappear had not disappeared. The women of Glenwood Springs, who had whispered in doorways about Eleanor Whitmore's size and her unfortunate prospects and the particular sadness of her situation, were not by and large women who spent a great deal of time in honest self-examination. But the story of what happened in January, the fraudulent survey, the night visit in the storm, the Denver attorney, the injunction was too specific and too documented to be dismissed or softened. And there is a particular discomfort in discovering that the person you dismissed has been the entire time more capable than you troubled to find out. Eleanor didn't know about those conversations. She was on the mountain. But Forsyth told her when he came back up in March to deliver the injunction paperwork and the initial findings of the fraud investigation that Garfield's operation had been larger than the Black Ridge land, 5 other boundary adjustments in 2 counties, all of them still being untangled, and that the filing discrepancy Eleanor had caught had been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire arrangement. The Denver Attorney General, Forsyth said carefully, is taking a significant interest in how the Territorial Land Office handles boundary surveys near silver claims. Your filing is the reason that interest was triggered. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. The date discrepancy, she said. 11 days, Forsyth said. 11 days, and the whole structure started coming apart. Ronan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at this table for a moment, then at Forsyth. The other 5 properties, she said. Will they get their land back? 3 of them, Forsyth said. The other 2 are more complicated. The sales went through before the investigation. But they'll be compensated. He paused. You could have a significant civil claim yourself, given the evidence of coordinated fraud. What would I have to do? Eleanor said. Testify. Provide documentation. It would take time. Eleanor looked at Ronan. We'll do it, Ronan said before she'd said anything. I know, Eleanor said. Forsyth left with his papers and his good horse, and the mountain moved into March, with the first suggestions of spring beginning to show in the length of the days and the quality of the light. And Eleanor and Ronan Blackridge lived in their cabin and worked their land, and waited for the fraud investigation to conclude, and planned a wedding that would happen in the spring, when the trail was passable enough for the Marble Creek preacher to make the climb. The letter from Thomas arrived in late March. It was the longest letter Thomas Whitmore had ever written to anyone, which was not saying a great deal, since Thomas was not naturally a long letter man. But it was long by his standards, and it was direct in the way that the January letter had been direct, without subtlety, without the careful social navigation that had always felt to Eleanor like his way of never quite committing to a position. He said he was sorry. Not for one thing specifically, but broadly, which was actually harder because it required acknowledging the pattern rather than the incident. He said he had been wrong about her capacity. He said he had been wrong about what she deserved. He said he had done what he did in January because he had read her letter from the mountain, the one with the winter supply calculations she had sent Ronan in November, which Ronan had apparently forwarded to the Marble Creek attorney, which had somehow found its way to Thomas via a chain. Eleanor did not fully reconstruct, and he had understood reading it that he had spent his entire life mistaking his sister's patience for passivity. The woman who wrote those calculations he wrote is not a woman who needed saving from the mountain. She is a woman who needed the mountain to have the room she was never given. I am sorry I was not the one who gave it to her. Eleanor read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in the tin with the land documents and Forsyth's filings, and the original notice she had taken from the board in Glenwood Springs, which she had kept without quite examining why. She understood why now. It was the first document that had ever told her in print that what she looked like was not the measure of what she was worth. She kept the tin on the shelf where she could see it, not as a reminder of hard things, as a record of real ones. Ronan came in from the stable one afternoon in late March and found Eleanor at the table with Agnes sitting at her feet. Agnes had at some point decided that her outdoor territory extended to the kitchen mat on cold days, and Eleanor had at some point decided not to fight it. And Eleanor was writing a letter. He came and stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Thomas," he said, looking at the page. "Yes," she said. "What are you telling him?" Eleanor looked at what she'd written. That the wedding is April 15th. That the trail will be passable. That I would like him to come if he wants to, and that I won't hold it against him if he doesn't. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Will you hold it against him?" he said. "If he doesn't come?" Eleanor considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "No," she said. "He did what he could when it mattered. That counts." She paused. "He's still my brother. I'm still his sister. We'll figure out what that means from here." Ronan put his hand on her shoulder. Not heavy, just there, warm and certain. "You're more generous than he deserves," he said. "Maybe," Eleanor said. "But I'm not generous for him. I'm generous for me. Carrying the weight of it serves nobody." His hand moved slightly on her shoulder. "May used to say something like that," he said. Eleanor looked up at him. He was smiling. It was a real smile, not the restrained, almost thing she had seen in December, but a full one, the kind that rearranged his face into something younger and more open and entirely completely his. She had never seen him smile like that before. She thought, "I will spend a long time learning all the things I have not yet seen." "Finish your letter," he said. "Agnes is going to eat the corner of it if you leave her unattended much longer." Eleanor looked down. Agnes was indeed eyeing the lower left corner of the paper with territorial interest. "Agnes," Eleanor said firmly. Agnes looked at her with the flat, devoted, utterly unrepentant gaze of a creature who had transferred her primary loyalty and intended to extract maximum benefit from the arrangement. "She's never going to stop trying," Ronan said. "No?" Eleanor agreed. "But she hasn't succeeded yet." She pulled the letter out of Agnes's reach and kept writing, and Ronan moved to the stove, and the afternoon light came through the window the way it did in late March. Longer and softer than it had been in January, touching things differently, and the cabin held them both, and the mountain held the cabin, and somewhere in Denver, a fraud investigation was proceeding through its careful, document-heavy stages, and in Glenwood Springs, a town was quietly revising its assessment of a woman it had dismissed, and in the tin on the shelf were documents and letters, and one old notice that had said no beauty required, and had told the truth in ways its author had not intended. And at the table, in the last of the afternoon light, Eleanor Whitmore, soon to be Eleanor Blackridge, and fully intending to be exactly as much of both of those women as the situation required at any given moment, finished her letter to her brother, and folded it precisely, and set it aside. Then she looked across the room, at the man she had found on a mountain she had climbed because she had nowhere else to go. He was looking back at her, and the smile was still there. Thomas Whitmore came. Eleanor had not been certain he would. She had written the letter without expectation, sealed it without hope, and sent it down the mountain with Forsyth on his March ride back to Denver. She had told herself she was at peace with either answer. She had been mostly telling the truth. But on the morning of April 14th, the day before the wedding, with the trail finally passable, and the preacher from Marble Creek already installed in the cabin's back room, and Agnes terrorizing his bootlaces, Eleanor heard horses in the clearing, and looked out and saw her brother climbing down from a hired mount, with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had not ridden long distances recently and was paying for it. He looked older than she remembered. That was the first thing. He had always been a man who looked precisely his age, no more and no less. But the winter had done something to him. Put lines around his eyes that weren't there in the autumn, taken some of the settled self-certainty out of the set of his shoulders. He stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin, and then he saw Eleanor in the doorway, and he stopped moving entirely. She went out to meet him. They stood in the yard 3 feet apart in the April morning, with the last of the mountain snow melting off the pines and the first mud of spring under their boots, and Eleanor looked at her brother, and her brother looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "You look well," Thomas said finally. His voice was careful, a man testing ice. "I am well," Eleanor said. "The mountain." He glanced up at the peaks still white above them. "It suits you." "Yes?" Eleanor said. "It does." Another silence. Thomas was holding his hat in his hands, turning it slightly, a nervous gesture she recognized from childhood. He'd done it at their mother's funeral, turning his hat in his hands because he didn't know what to do with himself when the situation was larger than his ability to manage it. "I should have," he started. "Thomas," Eleanor said. He stopped. "You came," she said. "That's what matters today." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face moved through several things rapidly and settled on something that might have been relief. "You're more like Mother than you know," he said quietly. Eleanor felt that land in her chest, not painfully, but with weight. Their mother had been a woman of great patience and little credit, which was a combination Eleanor understood intimately. "Come inside," she said. "Ronan wants to meet you." The meeting between Ronan and Thomas Whitmore was one of the more interesting things Eleanor had ever witnessed, which was saying something given the preceding winter. They were both large men, both quiet, both possessed of the particular stillness of people who made their assessments before they spoke, rather than while speaking. They shook hands in the kitchen with the focused attention of two people measuring something, and Eleanor stood to the side and watched them do it, and thought that May would have found this entire scene enormously entertaining. "You wrote to the Denver land office," Ronan said. "I did," Thomas said. "Before you wrote to Eleanor," Ronan said. A pause. "Yes," Thomas said, and had the decency not to look away. "Why?" Thomas considered it. "Because I didn't know if she'd accept help from me directly. And because the land situation was urgent, and the other matters could wait." He paused again. "And because it was the kind of thing I could do without having to look her in the eye while I did it, which was cowardly, and I'm aware of it." Ronan looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said. That was all. But the temperature in the room changed, and Thomas appeared to understand that he had passed something, and Eleanor poured coffee for all three of them, and the conversation moved to other things. The fraud investigation, the spring planting, the repair work still needed on the east section of the roof, and by the evening, Thomas was drying supper dishes while Eleanor washed them, which was something she could not remember him doing once in the 6 years she had kept his house. She didn't comment on it, he didn't explain it. Some things are better accepted than examined. The wedding happened on April 15th in the yard outside the cabin, because the morning came in clear and cold and bright, in the way April mornings in the mountains sometimes do, all washed light and new air, and the sound of water running somewhere below where the snow was letting go of the high ground. The preacher from Marble Creek was a small man with an enormous voice who clearly felt that the setting required him to bring everything he had, and he brought it. Ronan wore his good coat. Eleanor wore the dress she had altered through the winter. Not the old brown one she'd arrived in, but a dark blue wool she'd found in a trunk in the storage room, which had belonged to May, and which Ronan had offered her with a quietness that she had understood to mean something important, and which she had accepted with the same quietness. She had taken it in and let it out, and adjusted it until it fit her body as it actually was not as she wished it to be, not as anyone else thought it should be, but as it was here and now hers. Thomas stood to her left. He did not cry because Thomas Whitmore was constitutionally opposed to crying in company, but Eleanor saw him press his mouth together once during the vows, hard the way a person does when something is requiring more composure than they budgeted for. Agnes had been secured in the stable at Ronan's insistence. From the stable came periodic sounds of protest that the preacher's enormous voice successfully covered. Eleanor looked at Ronan when she said her vows. He looked back at her. The words were the old words, the ones that had been said in 1,000 different circumstances and 1,000 different yards across 100 years. And they were not, she thought, insufficient. They said what they needed to say. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer. She had come to him with nothing. He had offered her everything he had, which at the time was a cold backroom and a contrary goat and a mountain that did not care whether she survived it. She had matched him with everything she had, which was her hands and her mind, and the stubbornness of a woman who had been told her whole life that she wasn't worth the trouble, and had quietly, persistently refused to believe it. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Ronan cupped her face in his large, rough hands and kissed her once, careful and deliberate, and entirely his, and Eleanor felt the solid truth of it move through her from the ground up. Then he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, and they turned around, and Thomas was looking at them with his hat in his hands, and Forsyth, who had ridden up from Marble Creek for the occasion, and was standing slightly to the left of the preacher, with his satchel still slung over one shoulder, as if he could not quite bring himself to be completely off duty, was looking at them too, and the mountain was there, and the spring was there, and Eleanor Blackridge was there entirely and without apology. The celebration was simple and fitting coffee-dried apple cake that Eleanor had been perfecting since December, and a bottle of whiskey that Ronan produced from a place in the stable. He had apparently been keeping it for an occasion worthy of it. The preacher turned out to be an excellent storyteller when given the right company and the right amount of whiskey, and Thomas, who had not laughed freely in Eleanor's presence since they were children, laughed twice. Both times Eleanor noticed. Both times she filed away. Thomas stayed 2 days. He was not a comfortable man in small spaces with limited options, and the mountain was not his natural terrain. And by the second day, Eleanor could see the town pulling at him the way it always had, the town and the house and the routines that were his armor against a world he managed by controlling the variables. She didn't hold it against him. She understood it better than he might have thought. When he left, he stood at the edge of the clearing with his hired horse and his adjusted posture, and he said, "You're happy." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You were never in Glenwood Springs." He stopped, started again. "I thought I was being practical." "I know," Eleanor said. "I was wrong," he said, "about what was practical, about what you needed, about what you were." He stopped again, and she let him stop because she was not going to help him find the words for something he needed to find himself. "About what you were capable of," he finished. "I was wrong." Eleanor looked at her brother in the April light. "Yes," she said, "you were." No softening of it. No, "It's all right," or "I understand," or "Don't worry about it." Just the plain truth offered without cruelty and without cushioning, because she was Eleanor Blackridge now, and she did not apologize for the space she occupied, and she did not apologize for the truth of things. Thomas nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting something he had been handed. "I'll come back," he said. "In the summer, maybe." "The trail's better in summer," Eleanor said. "I'll come back," he said again, as if he needed to say it twice to make it real. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'll have the back room ready." He mounted his horse. He looked at her once more from that height, her brother who had tried to erase her with a $50 bill and a newspaper notice, and had ended up by some crooked path through his own failures, helping to save the land she stood on. He tipped his hat. Eleanor raised her hand. He rode down the mountain. She stood and watched until the sound of hooves faded into the quiet, and then she went back inside, where Ronan was drinking coffee, and Forsyth was making one final review of the injunction paperwork before his own departure, and Agnes had somehow gotten out of the stable again, and was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression of complete vindication. "Agnes," Eleanor said. Agnes walked past her and sat down on the kitchen mat and began cleaning her ear with the focused dedication of a creature who has won. "She picked the latch," Ronan said without looking up from his coffee. "Second time this week." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm going to have to build her a better latch." "Or a better stable," Ronan said. "Or accept that Agnes goes where she wants," Forsyth offered from behind his papers. They all three considered Agnes, who was now entirely unconcerned with any of them. "That's probably the most realistic assessment," Eleanor said. Forsyth left that afternoon with all his papers and his good horse, and the promise of documentation once the fraud investigation reached its final conclusions, which he expected would be by autumn. He shook Ronan's hand and shook Eleanor's hand, and said with the careful precision of a man who had been a lawyer long enough to know when someone had done something that mattered. "What you caught, Mrs. Blackridge. Those 11 days there are 5 families in this territory who still have their land because of it. I thought you should know that specifically." Eleanor held that for a moment. "They would have found it eventually," she said. "Maybe," Forsyth said. "But eventually is a very expensive place to live." He rode down the mountain, and the clearing was quiet, and it was just the two of them, and Agnes, and the horses, and the coming spring. And Eleanor stood in the yard for a long moment, looking up at the peaks that had received her in October, like a test she hadn't known she was taking. She had passed. Not because the mountain had made her someone new. Not because Ronan had fixed her, or rescued her, or shown her something she couldn't have found alone. She had passed because she had always been capable of passing, and had finally been in a place that required her to prove it to herself more than to anyone else. The mountain had not given her her strength. It had given her the room to use it. She went inside. The days that followed had the particular quality of early spring on the mountain, Everything still cold enough to be serious, but with light that had changed its mind about the world, coming in at new angles, staying longer, doing something different with the hours. Eleanor started the spring planting preparations, working from a list she had built through the winter, cross-referenced against Ronan's records from previous years, and her own estimates from the farm. She ordered seeds through the Marble Creek supply run. The Harmon boys were back now that Garfield's operation had been legally suspended, and the trading post had changed hands to a man named Rourke, who had no particular opinions about anyone's business. Ronan worked the trap line through the last weeks of the season, and Eleanor managed the cabin, and they came together in the evenings the way they had been doing since December at the table with coffee, working through whatever needed working through, and sometimes in companionable silence, and sometimes in conversation that went long into the night. One evening in late April, Ronan came in from the trapline with something in his expression that Eleanor recognized as news he was deciding how to deliver. "Tell me," she said. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. "Ran into a man on the Eastern Trail," he said. "Came up from Marble Creek. Said there's a woman in Glenwood Springs looking for a position as a hired hand on a ranch. Word is, she's capable and hard-working, and nobody in town will give her a chance because—" He paused. "Because of how she looks." Eleanor was very still. "How old?" she said. He didn't say. "Young, I think." Eleanor looked at the table. She thought about a notice on a board outside a general store. She thought about 3 words, "No beauty required." She thought about what those words had cost Ronan to write, and what they had meant to her, and what the difference was between a world that required a woman to disappear and a world that had room for her. "We have the back room," she said. Ronan looked at her. "Eleanor, we have the back room?" she said again. "The spring planting is more than 2 people, really. We could use the help." She looked at him directly. "And she needs someone who won't decide what she is before they know her." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll send word down tomorrow." Eleanor nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the tin on the shelf, the one with the documents and the letters and the old notice, and she thought about the morning she had walked out of Glenwood Springs with her bag and her coat and her twice-resoled boots, and the absolute conviction that she was not going to disappear for $50. She had been right about that. She had been right about more things than she'd known she was right about standing on that cold street pulling a piece of paper off a board. She had been right about the mountain. She had been right about the work. She had been right about what she deserved even when nobody else was telling her so, even when the voice in her own head was working against her, even when the whole weight of what people had decided about her was pressing her towards smallness. She had been right. In May, the woman from Glenwood Springs arrived at the cabin on a hired mule with a small bag and a careful, guarded expression that Eleanor recognized the way you recognize something you have seen in a mirror. She was perhaps 22 years old, solid and strong, and trying very hard to look as if she was not afraid, and she stood in the clearing and looked at Eleanor with the specific wariness of someone who has been assessed and dismissed so many times that the assessment is the first thing they brace for in every new face. Eleanor didn't assess her. She said, "I'm Eleanor. You must be hungry. Come in." The woman's name was Ruth. She was from Ohio originally, which was how she'd ended up in Glenwood Springs, following family that had turned out to be less reliable than advertised, which was a story Eleanor understood in its bones. She was quiet the first day and watchful the second, and by the third, she was asking questions about the spring planting schedule with the focused attention of someone who wanted to understand the system rather than just follow instructions. Eleanor gave her the system, all of it, the lists, the supply calculations, the weather, reading, the animal rhythms. She gave it the way Ronan had given her Agnes's feeding schedule on the first morning, practically without condescension, as one capable person sharing information with another capable person. Ruth absorbed it the way Eleanor had absorbed everything on this mountain, completely and without waste. On the 4th evening, Ronan came in from the trapline and found Eleanor and Ruth at the table with the spring planting maps spread out between them, arguing cheerfully about the optimal placement of the vegetable rows relative to the water source. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene with an expression that Eleanor caught from across the room, something quiet and warm, and deeply satisfied, the expression of a man who has watched something he hoped for become something real. She held his gaze for a moment. He tipped his head very slightly, the way he did when words were insufficient. She understood. Summer came to Elk Hollow in the particular way it comes to high mountain places, slowly and with great effort and briefly, but with a beauty that makes the brevity beside the point. The garden grew. The animals thrived. The fraud investigation concluded in August, and Garfield was charged in a Denver court with fraudulent land survey activity in 4 counties, and the Territorial Land Office conducted its own review and fired 2 employees and instituted new filing requirements that the Marble Creek attorney called long overdue, with the weary satisfaction of someone who has been saying so for years. The eastern boundary of the Black Ridge property was confirmed in its original registration. The water source stayed where it had always been. The silver stayed where it had always been, too underground and unreachable for now, which was fine. Eleanor was not interested in silver. She was interested in the land above it, in the garden, and the animals, and the repaired roof, and the stable that now had a latch. Even Agnes had not yet defeated, and the cabin that had been cold when she arrived and was warm now in ways that went considerably deeper than the fireplace. Thomas came in July as promised. He stayed a week and helped Ronan reinforce the east wall and did not complain about the work and ate everything Eleanor put in front of him, and on his last evening sat on the step outside the cabin door with Ruth and talked for a long time about Ohio, which was where Thomas had once thought about going himself. And Eleanor watched from the window and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled her whole life. Not fixed, not resolved into something clean and simple, but settled the way a mountain settles, which is not stillness, but a deeper kind of motion, slow and enormous, and going somewhere you cannot always see. On a night in late August, with the summer starting to let go at the edges, and the first cool note arriving in the evening air that meant the mountains were thinking about autumn, Eleanor and Ronan sat on the step outside the cabin door. Ruth was inside. The horses were quiet. Agnes was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, which was Agnes's natural condition, and which Eleanor had entirely made her peace with. The sky above Elk Hollow was doing what the sky does at altitude on a clear August night, being absolutely full of itself, crowded with stars, in a way that the sky at lower elevations never quite manages, as if the altitude brings you closer to all of it. Ronan's shoulder was warm against hers. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said. "I know," Ronan said. "You've had that look since Tuesday." She smiled. He knew her face. He had learned it the way she had learned Agnes's angles, carefully over time, with attention paid to which approach yielded what result. She found this not alarming, but entirely right. "I've been thinking about the notice," she said. "The one you put on the board." "What about it?" "Did you know," she said, "when you wrote it, did you know that someone would see it and need it the way I needed it?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "I knew I was in trouble," he said. "I knew winter was coming, and I knew I needed someone." He paused. "I knew I needed someone real, someone who would still be here in February." "That's all you were thinking," Eleanor said. "That's what I was thinking at the desk," Ronan said. "There were other things underneath that I wasn't paying close enough attention to." He looked at her. "I think I was also thinking that I was tired of the mountain being something I survived instead of something I lived." Eleanor held that. "No beauty required," she said. "No beauty required," he said, "though for what it's worth." His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. "I was wrong about that too." Eleanor looked at him. "You think I'm beautiful," she said. Not a question. A statement, because she had learned to receive the truth of things without deflecting or diminishing. "I think," Ronan said, "that you are the most." He paused, finding the word, the way he always found words, by making sure they were the right ones before he used them. "The most complete person I have ever known. And yes, that includes all of it." Eleanor Blackridge sat with that. She let it be true. She did not argue it or qualify it or find the ways it might not apply. She had spent 28 years finding the ways things did not apply to her, and she was done with that. She let it be true the way the mountain was true completely, and without apology, and with the weight of something that would still be standing long after everyone who doubted it was gone. "I came up here," she said, "with nothing but a bag and a knife my father gave me." "I know," Ronan said. "I didn't know what I was walking into." "Neither did I," he said. "And now?" She looked at the stars, at the peaks, at the garden that had grown from her hands, and the roof she had helped repair, and the stable where Agnes was definitely doing something inadvisable. "And now this is the whole world," she said. "And it's enough. It's more than enough. It's—" She paused, searching for the word, the way he searched for words, because she had learned that from him too, the value of the right word over the convenient one. "It's mine," she said. "This is mine." Ronan took her hand. "Ours," he said. Eleanor Blackridge looked at her husband in the August dark, and she felt the solid, unshakable truth of everything she had become, not despite the mountain, not despite the cold, or the hard work, or the fraudulent surveys, or her brother's cowardice, or the years of being told she was too much and not enough at the same time, but through all of it, because of all of it in the way iron becomes steel. She had arrived with a bag and a knife and a stubbornness she hadn't yet learned to call a virtue. She had become a woman who held a line in a January storm, who caught 11 days in a document and unraveled a fraud across 4 counties, who opened her door to a young woman from Ohio because she remembered what it felt like to need a door opened, who had learned every angle of a contrary goat, and the weather patterns of a Colorado mountain, and the exact weight of a hand she had come to trust more than anything in her life. She had not become someone else. She had become more completely herself than she had ever been allowed to be, and that was the only becoming that had ever mattered. The mountain had not saved her. She had saved herself on the mountain with the mountain, because the mountain had the room for it, and Ronan Blackridge had seen her in it, and never once asked her to take up less of it. And that, in the end, was the whole truth of Eleanor Whitmore, who became Eleanor Blackridge, who climbed a mountain because she had nowhere left to go, and found at the top of it that she had always been exactly where she needed to be. She just hadn't had the ground under her yet. Now she did. And she was never for a single day of the rest of her life letting go of it.